Good evening, comrades. Welcome to the latest session in our series, Why Marx? Tonight, we want to discuss the nature of the real existing socialist states, or formerly existing states like the USSR, China, North Korea, Cuba. I want to could add East Germany. Having grown up in West Germany, it was very, very difficult being a self-defined socialist or communist. You were all the time was told to, fuck off to East Germany if you like the Stasi so much. And any self-definition had to start with, yes, I'm a socialist, I'm a communist, but not like, so the existence of the USSR, East Germany, etc., was no doubt a problem for socialists and communists. The Russian Revolution, of course, was one of the greatest heroic victories of the international working class struggle. But when the Germans failed to make revolution and spread it, it turned into something else. The Russian Revolution turned into something quite else. And now today's Russia is something entirely different altogether. So we want to look at some of these issues around that. Would Marx and Engels have defined either of these states as socialist? Are they deformed worker states? Are they state capitalist states, or perhaps something altogether different? And what does it mean in terms of our attitude today to, say, the war in Ukraine and towards Russia and China? Of course, these are still huge issues that we can put a little spotlight on today. We can't probably all solve it all today, but we want to make a start in discussing this. All of our four speakers have different views on the issue, which is interesting, but unlike, until quite recently, we're not splitting over this issue. We don't think, the nature of these states is a reason to not work with each other. And we want to show that it is possible to work with each other and to have joint sessions and going forward, even though we don't agree on every dot and comma. So very pleased to start with Comrade Ian Spencer, who I believe has studied under Hillel Ticktin in Glasgow and has been influenced by his views on the matter. Hi, Ian.
Thank you. Thank you, comrades. Good evening. And as has been pointed out, I've studied under Hillel Ticktin for a number of years, and in a sense, he had a kind of unique position on the nature of the Soviet Union. Now, why worry about this today? After all, it's all gone, isn't it? The Soviet Union is no longer what it was when Hillel was writing about it in the 1970s. So what's the point of looking at it now? Well, first of all, because, as Tina has already pointed out, one of the great arguments against socialism or communism was, well, look at what it's like in Russia. Look at what it's like in the Soviet Union. Do you really want to live like that? Or other examples were often dragged out of kind of atrocities, or look at the invasion of, my own father, for example, who sort of flirted with joining the Communist Party, changed his mind very quickly after the intervention in Hungary in 1956. So the nature of the USSR was, of course, a crucial reason, and still is cited as, it failed in Russia, it failed in the Soviet Union. Why should we even think about entertaining the idea of socialism today? Another point, of course, is that in the past, various left-wing groups fought bitter battles over whether it was state socialist or state capitalist or a worker state of one sort or another. Why then concentrate on Hillel Ticktin's perspective? This book is probably out of print now, The Origins of the Crisis in the USSR, but of course Hillel's work was mostly publicized through the journal Critique and continues to be. He's a South African Trotskyist who was a political refugee in the Soviet Union, either faced getting arrested as an anti-apartheid Trotskyist who was also opposed to the ANC because they were dominated by the South African Communist Party, and fled to Russia, where he was doing his PhD on the Soviet Union. And the point about that, of course, isn't sort of adulation for Hillel Ticktin, but it was the fact that he was immersed in the society himself. His son was born there. He lived there for a number of years while he was working on his PhD thesis on South Africa. And what I think his distinctive contribution is the question of the political economy of the Soviet Union. What was it that was distinctive on the one hand, yes, it was a genuine attempt at a socialist revolution, and no one here, I think, will argue that Lenin and the rest shouldn't have even tried, because, you know, presented with the opportunity to take power and possibly provide the spark to the world revolution, why wouldn't you? People have argued that, but here I'm not suggesting for one moment of disavowing anything to do with the Russian Revolution. What, of course, happens subsequently is what is up for debate. And what's important about Hillel's perspective is that it was immersed in an understanding of the real political economy of the Soviet Union, rather than a whole series of formulaic attempts to portray the Soviet Union as this, that, or the other. And of course, it's therefore a telling analysis of Stalinism. Stalinism as a doctrine of the possibility of socialism in one country. So what are those different perspectives? If one can look at Western Sovietology, for the want of a better word, much of which was tied to the Cold War, determined to prove the superiority of capitalism. So, for example, if we, you know, a typical thing, Russia's political hospitals, Marxism, Leninism will always interfere in matters of science and produce an absolute horror story. This was the typical thing that you got from Western Sovietologists. The totalitarian thesis, the idea that of an all-encompassing type of state, but one which, you know, each one of these perspectives has some merit, and you can learn something from them. But they also have their faults, the weaknesses. You know, to describe the Soviet Union as totalitarian and then at the same time say that, well, Nazi Germany was also totalitarian, ignores the very great differences that existed between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. To talk about state capitalism, and state capitalism as a category was, as far as I'm aware, first put forward by the Dutch and German Council Communists in the 1920s, but also was picked up in the UK by the Socialist Party of Great Britain, and they've maintained that position ever since. The importance is, of course, that Stalinism has been a defining feature of the last century, and one way or another we have to deal with it or understand it, and understand how it can be superseded. And of course, the existence of Stalinism and the nature of the Soviet Union was a direct result of the defeat of the October Revolution, not merely at the borders of the former Russian Empire with the defeat of the German Revolution and the Hungarian Revolution, but also within the Soviet Union itself. By 1937, of course, any old Bolsheviks who still harbored any wish to move towards a genuinely socialist society would be dead. And along with them, many of the people who were capable of understanding the period of time, that period in history, theoretically, and being able to use that knowledge to advance world revolution elsewhere. And what Stalin didn't kill, Hitler did for him. So looking at the political economy then of the Soviet elite very quickly, looking at the political economy of the Soviet Union, Hillel in a sense has a bit of a difficulty here. What do we call it? Because actually, if you don't own the means of production, then you're not really a class. You can't really talk about the Soviet ruling class because it didn't own the means of production. If you were the director of a huge factory, you were the director of a huge factory, but you could be removed at any time. And that meant that, among other things, you couldn't pass that property on to your children or anyone else for that matter. You couldn't be, it could never be secure. What the state gives, it can take away from you. So Hillel sells the term elite, not because it's a precise term, but for the want of a better phrase, really. But the point is that the Soviet ruling group or caste or whatever you want to use, whatever term you want to use, was not really a class in the sense that what was its relationship to the means of production? It controlled it, but it didn't own it, and it couldn't pass it on. There were, of course, internal struggles within the Soviet League. I mean, if you think back to the fight between Ligachev and Yeltsin about which direction to take. I remember when I was living in Russia myself as a student, one of my teachers, who was the only person I ever found who was actually recognizably a socialist in Russia, as we might understand the term here, said to me, perhaps Brezhnev was the most intelligent of all the Soviet leaders because he recognized that you couldn't reform that system at all. And the point is that there were attempts to reform it and move to the market. And there were those like Ligachev who felt that any kind of attempt to reform the system would mean they could lose everything. And of course, those in the elite that wanted to move to the market ultimately did. And those who once controlled the factories eventually got to own them and preferably move the assets out of the country into Switzerland, Cyprus, almost anywhere, and preferably into hard currency rather than, and certainly not into rubles, which wasn't even money, if you think about it, in what Marx means by money in volume 1 of Capital. So it was a ruling group, but not a class. And it was genuinely elitist. I mean, occasionally workers will be referred to by the Russian term squat, which means domestic livestock. And the Soviet elite controlled the KGB and the army. But the point was as well, was that everybody knew they lived better. The car, by the way, you see in front of you is a Chaika, which in Russian means seagull. But as you can see, it's a rip-off of a 1950s, 60s Cadillac or something. Anyway, the point is that they were genuinely elitist and everybody knew they lived better. The Chaika was a car much favored by the Politburo, and this is what they would drive around in. And actually, if you look at wealthy Russians today, their favorite transport still seems to be the black Mercedes-Benz. So no ideological, people knew they lived better and everybody could see it. They knew they lived in misery because the Soviet elite lived better. So the amount of ideology that there was in the Soviet Union was actually minimal. It was formally, a socialist society, but anything but socialist, because there was no democracy, there was no control, there was no opportunity for workers to express themselves independently. The poster here says Slava Uchitelyu, glory to the teacher, the educator of the builders of communism. The Soviet intelligentsia occupied an intermediate group in a sense, and it too wanted in a sense to go to the market because you had a period of expansion of the Soviet intelligentsia, but there came a point where it couldn't expand much more. And actually the intelligentsia were worse off in many ways than skilled workers. I knew one doctor who said he earned more on his way to and from work, picking up people and dropping them off as a taxi driver, than he did from his professorial work as a doctor. It was an interesting illustration about the relationship between Soviet political economy and the different and the way in which social groups were different. So they often paid much less work. Concessions were made to the intelligentsia, particularly under Khrushchev, for example. So an opportunity to express yourself more fully, an opportunity to express yourself in order to make the system work better, rather than to challenge it. And also this other important thing, and I'm going to come back to this, and it's the question about the rule of law. Even now, and this is why it's important to talk about what the Soviet Union was, because the workers didn't sell their labor power in the same way. And from that point of view, they too were not a class in the same way as we might think about capitalism. And because you were compelled to sell your labor, you were working under conditions of semi-forced labor. It was illegal not to have a job. It was illegal not to go to work. Famously, Andropov, for the short period of time he was in office, once threw a cordon around the state universal stores in Moscow and demanded that everybody produce their sick notes. Why the hell were they not at work? So the workers alienated their labor power, but they didn't sell it, not least of which because money wasn't really money. You needed about 6 things to buy a bottle of vodka when I was there, and money was the least important of them. First of all, you needed to find the vodka. Then you needed all day to queue for the bloody thing, and then you needed a ration coupon, and then you needed an empty bottle because they wouldn't sell you one unless you brought an empty bottle back. And only then was the money important. So Soviet workers were hugely atomized. There was no collective organization. You only had a negative control over work. So as it was illegal not to go to work, it was also illegal. You couldn't be sacked. So from that point of view, Russians used to say, well, they pretend to pay us, so we pretend to work. And it's a good illustration. So the Soviet labor power itself was as defective as every other Soviet product. If anybody remembers this is the Lada Riva, a 1970s Fiat built by drunk men. And so because you had no control over workers, and workers had a kind of negative control over the work process, most Soviet products were absolutely rubbish. And if you were the person who made the widgets to go into a machine, and let's say the widgets had to be 2 millimeters, and you were presented a plan in expressed in tons, and you thought, well, if I do 2 millimeter widgets, we'll never fulfill the plan, comrade. So let's produce 2.1 millimeters. And so you could make it because the plan was expressed in weight. So you can meet your quota for the 5-year plan. But that passed the defect on to the next item, and the outcome was, of course, the Lada car. When I say it was a 1970s Fiat built by drunk men, I meant literally, because I remember very well when I was living in Moscow, people keep, clubbing together for a bottle of vodka on the way to work. And it was an extraordinary illustration. Of course, not all Soviet workers were controlled to that extent, and some, for example, working in more privileged areas, did have some control exerted over them. But there wasn't the same kind of commodity fetishism. There wasn't control. Couldn't be exerted through a reserve army of labor. What you had, of course, was the KGB, and the KGB wasn't just a group of officers at the middle, but it was in concentric circles. And maybe at the outset, it'd be your next door neighbor who would grass you up, or the dejurna working in the hotel who handed out the keys in the morning, who would report who was coming and going. So the point I'm making here is that unlike an assertion of a worker state, there is nothing progressive. There was nothing progressive in the Soviet. Yes, there were certain gains of the revolution that were maintained: free education, free healthcare. And yes, it was a disaster for many workers when the Soviet Union collapsed. Average life expectancy dropped 10 years in 10 years in the first 10 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the biggest cause of deaths rising in men was accidents, violence, and poisoning. People were getting drunk and killing one another. So if it was so good, then why was it so bad? And the point is that, from my point of view as a communist, the defense of the Soviet Union, because it supported national liberation struggles, so-called, or whatever else, is not a good enough reason for supporting a society which effectively did everything it could to destroy workers' movements across the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. A very interesting first introduction, which I'm sure will lead to disagreements from some of the other speakers and perhaps from the floor later on. John Holliday, who is our next speaker from the Socialist Theory Study Group, I believe has a more state capitalist view of the Soviet Union and related regimes. Hi, John.
Hello.
Oh,
yeah, sorry about that. And I have to point out what it says here, I'm Socialist Theory Study Group. I don't speak for the Socialist Theory Study Group. We're quite a small group with a number of differing views on the topic. And I say that because I know some people are in the audience from our group who, probably vehemently disagree with what I'm about to say. Not that, I mean, that was a very interesting presentation, Ian, and I can't say that I've read all of Hillel Tikhtin. I have read some of the articles and some of the commentaries on his views. I do tend to take that view of state capital, basically because, well, let me just say for a start, I think we can all agree that whatever it is not a socialist society, and there's no socialism in one country. I think most of the speakers in this panel will agree with that whatever was happening in the Soviet Union, it certainly did not develop into a socialist society. And, all the elements of what we understand by socialism are not, implied within that society. I start off from that perspective because I come probably from a different perspective. While I say I'm in favor of state capitalism, I start from the perspective that capitalism is a world system. It was a world system since the end of the 19th century. So it's the predominant system throughout the world. and was at the time of the Russian Revolution even, and has remained subsequently so. And really, you can't have socialism in that sort of environment when the dominant system is capital and capitalist forms of production. Now, of course, in Marxist system, as you take it from capital, and the mode of production is the crucial thing, not the form of government, not what the ruling class say about what they've got, because they always say they're a people's democracy or the communist society, a socialist republic or whatever. But you have to look at the social relations of production, the mode of production. And I take those mainly to be obviously capital, but money, commodity production, generalized commodity production, wage labor, as being the defining features of a capitalist society. Now, we're looking at the Soviet Union, obviously, over quite a period of time. I assume from 1917 right up until 1989, when I think most people would say it ended at that stage. But of course, things change and develop in a remarkably different form. So it's not as if you can take a snapshot of the Soviet Union saying it was exactly this, because some of the features that Ian has pointed out, do change over time. There was the new economic policy. There was a flirtation with the market forms, etc. within that society. The nature of wages, I would say that wages did exist within the Soviet Union, and they change over time. For the most part, it was the form of piecework wages to encourage production, that you had to fulfill your objectives in order to be paid directly. But there was quite a degree of variation also within wages, obviously between the ruling sectors, the management sectors, and the basic workers. There was also, various times, obviously, a large peasant population, which was basically depossessed and turned into wage laborers, so they couldn't rely on their forms of production within a peasant society. They were converted into wage laborers. There was also, as we know, quite a large prison population, concentration camps. There was a whole section of people who were sent off to Siberia and executed. So you're talking about a very diverse society for a start, which is very difficult to pin down. Having said that applies to most of Marx's writings in Capital. It's a very abstract system that he's created with these social relations of production, even within, and he focused on Britain when he was writing Capital, but even at that stage there was a great variation in the forms of capital, the forms of wage labor, the forms of ownership, etc. at that time that was developing. Now, it goes on to develop from those forms, but you can't really tie it down. And if you want to look within a system of world capitalism for specific societies, that every society has to conform to exact principles, then I don't think you will get anywhere at all, because virtually none of them do. So even if you look today, which I think most people would agree that we do have that world capitalist system, the nature of the different societies within that divided, integrated world market division of labor, some sections of society concentrating on producing raw materials, energy, others presenting on consumer goods, others concentrating on production goods. There's a whole series of division of labor within those societies. So trying to analyze them and say, well, this is a capitalist society, classically in Marxist analysis, would be very difficult indeed. I'll just take a few examples if you want them. Saudi Arabia, for example, look at that and try and get a classical picture of Marxist economy within that society, and whole series of societies with that. Having said that, I think you have to take it. I come from that perspective. While I say it was state capitalist, there are a whole variety of different forms of state capitalism as well, and some with remarkable private sectors involved in it, sections of state. Overall, the state has been a feature of most societies, and increasingly in most societies throughout the world, the state has taken an interventionist and far more positive role within those societies. That does not undermine the capital social relation, which is built upon, and the fundamental point is that notion of capital and wage labor. Capital not as a thing, not as some sort of it has to be an individualized perspective. Capital as a social relation. In Marx's writings, you find this all the time. He talks about capital when he's talking about capitalists. He stresses that he's talking about capitalists as a personification of capital. Now, capital as a social relation can take all sorts of different forms, and he specifies those in his various writings, from merchant capital, finance capital, but even state capital as well, money capital taking different forms within those societies, but remaining capital, and the fundamental form being that capitalist social relationship. So I think when you're looking at Marx, you've got to get that perspective, analyze societies from that point of view. I think that the main perspective is basically to see what happened in the Soviet Union. It'd be interesting in the discussion to see, Ian was talking about Hillel Tichtin's view, what Hillel Tichtin would make of the society in Russia today. Is that a capitalist society? Is China a capitalist society? I think for a large, what I've read of Hillel Tichtin, his notion is that it's a society in the form of transition from capitalism to socialism, and somehow that got deflected and resulted in all sorts of diversions. But is it still considered as a society in transition to socialism? I would say if you look at it, what you would find is that far from being a society in transition to socialism, even in the terms of the Soviet Union, it was a society in transition to capitalism. And I think that's the form that we have today, in almost every sense of that word. Now, why did that happen? As I said, you've got to take into account, first of all, the world market. Tina referred to Rosa Luxemburg's work, The Introduction to Political Economy, last week. And Rosa Luxemburg's perspective was from the very start, the world market, the world system, that you cannot understand a society as a national entity without taking into account the structures of the world market. If you look at what happened within Russian society and the Soviet Union, I would say what generally happened was you had a very backward society. The majority of that society, we did have forms of capitalism from an international perspective even then. The majority was peasant society. That was being, when the Bolsheviks took over, that began to be transformed, obviously with the intention of socialism, but eventually turned into a transition to capital. Marx, when he's writing Capital in volume 1, if you look at it, he ends up with those final chapters about the laws of accumulation and primitive, the origin of primitive accumulation, the origins of capitalism, forms of primitive accumulation. And he describes in those last chapters very brutal transformation of the population into wage workers and the accumulation of capital, a very brutal system. Now, if you can take that, I would say you can apply that exactly to the Soviet Union. Given the environment in which they existed, then they had to transform themselves very rapidly into a productive capitalist system so that they could compete on the world market with the other capitalist states. Now, I've talked, I won't talk any longer now because of the time, and I'm sure other people want to contribute, but I think you've also got to take into account what we were asked to discuss about not just the nature of the Soviet Union, but China, Cuba, Vietnam, all these states which have acquired that nomination of being socialist societies or worker states of one form or another. Tina referred to Eastern Europe as well. There's a whole variety of states that exist and have existed in the past. What tends, in my impression of all those states, the vast majority of them, in terms of what happened after national liberation struggles, you can apply that to Vietnam, to Cuba, etc., were gradually absorbed into the world capital system, aligning with one dominant imperialist capitalist power or another, absorbed into a world capitalist system. I think it's important to stress that, because if we do look at a socialist society, what we are talking about is a world society. Now, that's not something outrageous. Marx had that view from the very beginning when he was writing the German ideology. Throughout the German ideology, there is that notion of creating a world market and a worldwide proletariat. That is in the process of being created when Marx is writing in the 1840s, and it carries on throughout his writings. He did intend to produce a work on the world market itself. It remains in that thing, but throughout his writings in Capital and in the early writings, he's referring to the nature of that world system, a world system of capitalism, which then goes on to say you can only have socialism as a world system as well. And I'll finish there.
Matthew.
Thank you very much, John. Okay, our next speaker is Matthew. And Matthew comes more from a degenerated worker state position, I believe.
Yeah, I actually studied with Hillel as well. So it was good that Ian showed his book. I think it's very good, and it's well worth. If anybody, I don't know if it's online, but you can certainly see if you can get hold of the copy. It's well worth reading. It's very good. And the debates around, debates around critique also, which I think are really very useful in this subject. Well, I think the thing is, obviously, say we're studying, Stalinism is the major political phenomenon of the 20th century, the defining political phenomenon coming out of the main event. I mean, if you look at the Russian Revolution is the most important event in history because it points the way to a non-capitalist, socialist future. In however imperfect a way, as of course all the participants would quite happily admit. The point being, of course, is that what it's saying is Stalinism isn't in any way socialist, but clearly is based on that revolution. Now, I mean, there are three theories, that have been formalized in terms of an understanding of Stalinism. One is state capitalism, obviously, as has been discussed. One is a notion that it's a degenerate workers' state, which and other Stalinist countries a deformed workers' state, which is the one that I think the only one that actually stands up at the moment, or however imperfect it is. There's a third one, which was called bureaucratic collectivism, which held that in fact, of course, that Stalinism, the Stalinist bureaucracy was a new class. And that this system would go on for hundreds of years, which of course has been disproved by history, but it was held by a number of people, so some quite important characters on the left, although many of them, of course, degenerated into to the right. So, I mean, in those terms, there's also, of course, Hillel's theory. Hillel doesn't hold that he more or less says, well, this thing is essentially a dead end. He doesn't offer a real characterization. He says a dead end, which it clearly was. It was a dead end, and it's dysfunctional, which it clearly was as well. However, in those terms, I think you can slot that into a degenerate form worker state analysis, because obviously, if you go back over critique, you can see the debate between Mandel and Hillel, which is very useful, and other articles, which were published in that point. In terms of state capitalism, I mean, the problem is, of course, that it doesn't actually function under the Soviet Union, and none of the Stalinist countries function as capitalist economies. As Ian has pointed out, there's no money because you can't buy anything with it, and that was the problem with the working class had. They actually accumulated huge amounts of money that they couldn't actually spend because it doesn't function as money. It was notes, didn't buy things. There was no commodity, as the great Christian Rakovsky, who of course was a collaborator, a very long-term collaborator of Trotsky, one of Trotsky's most trusted friends, pointed out, and it is a brilliant article actually in Critique itself, that within months of the first 5-year plan, that one of the major products of Russian industry after when they moved to the 5-year plan was rubbish, i.e., unusable crap. And that was a characteristic of the entire system. Now obviously that is a feature. Clearly, if your industry produces unusable crap, then clearly you don't have the commodity. And as Ian also pointed out, of course, the law of value didn't apply either. You know, for none of these key features of Stalinism are actually, sorry, key features of capitalism are actually present in the system. You know, so in those terms, what we're also looking at is this contradiction of a profoundly counter-revolutionary system dominated by bureaucracy. You know, we're sitting on top of the gain of the October Revolution, and therefore it was able to actually stifle revolution for the remainder of the 20th century in key points. And this is really the dominant feature of it, is actually you know, that it was able to stifle revolution from the 20s onwards. And you can go through the whole list, you know, from, you know, the general strike in Britain through Canton in China, through Germany in 1933, where actually, of course, it's quite clear that if you hadn't had Stalin, Hitler would not come to power. You know, the betrayal of Spain, and worse, the worst actually, the lot, 1945, which is, I mean, after the Second World War, there should have been an overturn. There should have been, you know, the finish of capitalism, certainly in Europe. You know, with a relatively heavily armed working class in many countries, in particularly Italy and France, and others. That, you know, clearly, you know, capitalism would not survive, and the Americans knew this. They were terrified when they invaded France. They were terrified that they weren't going to be able to control the place. At that point, of course, the resistance, which was dominated by the CP, was heavily enough armed and well enough organised to hold off entire German divisions. And therefore, you know, the only reason that clearly the only reason that they re-established capitalism or a capitalist regime in France and Italy was through the CP. You then have to look at the fact that capitalism is capable of reproducing itself. Of course, Stalinism is, you know, this crazy distorted system run by this mad bureaucracy is then able to propagate itself throughout a chunk of the world. You know, it originates in the USSR, but after 1945, it actually spreads itself across much of East and Central Europe through the agency both of the Red Army and of you know, the partisan movements, particularly in Yugoslavia and Albania, through this very strange process. And then, of course, China itself. You know, China, the Chinese Revolution after the Second World War was on. You know, carried out by Chinese Stalinists, of course, who took careful, you know, as the usual process, took careful regard to kill any Trotskyists they could find. I mean, Trotskyists, of course, the actual revolutionaries, and also in Indochina. Indochina, of course, is very strange, you know, because obviously, actually, the Vietnamese communists, the Viet Minh, actually had control of the country in 1945 again, but they were ordered by Stalin to allow the imperialists back into the country, which they did. Before, the first thing they did, of course, was to kill the Trotskyists, and then they allowed the French back into Vietnam, thus meaning there was 30 years and millions of unnecessary war and unnecessary death, precisely because of the counter-revolutionary nature of Stalinism. If you look at you know, Eastern Europe, this is this very strange phenomenon. Actually, when the Red Army invades and drives out the Nazis, or you know, finally crushes the Nazis, of course, is that you have this wave of the working class taking over the factories and so on, and a move towards nationalization. And the Stalinists actually then recreate capitalist parties. In the case of Yugoslavia, they actually had to import them because they'd all fled. And they actually recreate actual serious capitalist parties and form coalitions and actually reinstate capitalist states for a temporary period until it becomes clear to Stalin by 1947 or so that he isn't going to get a deal with his friendly imperialists, that they have turned on him, and that therefore he, you know, while he requires a buffer, if he wants to keep it, he's going to have to dispose of his erstwhile capitalist front guys. So they did. They had a big purge, both of the capitalists and of sections of the CP. And of course, then you get this sort of strange phenomenon of things like the Slansky trial and the Reich trial, and the Slansky trial in Czechoslovakia and the Reich trial in Hungary, in which, besides being, of course, anti-Semitic, which Stalin was, also, of course, were a means of disposing of chunks of the bureaucracy in the classic Stalinist method. Now, the thing is, of course, what it does then is to say, in that sense, Stalinism actually acts to restabilize capitalism, and you get a position and this, the Cold War system, whereby Stalinism, there's essentially Stalinism is used as a bureaucratic control, in concert with the imperialists, and particularly the US, in order to control the working class. Interestingly enough, the point being, of course, in the Stalinist countries themselves, particularly in Eastern Central Europe, there is then a series of explosive revolts, and you can go through it. So, there's whole chunks of them. 53 in East Germany, 56 in Poland and Hungary, 68 in Czechoslovakia, 70 Czechoslovakia and Poland, 70 in Poland, 76 in Poland, 80 in Poland. In which actually, of course, the working class revolts, against the system. When it does so, of course, it has a tendency, of course, to seize the factories and form committees and actually sort of pose the question, well, can we actually dispose of these people? In those terms, it will quickly, usually crush with military power. Which, of course, the problem being, the exception being, Poland, which was understood very well, actually, of course, well, you can invade small countries like Czechoslovakia and Hungary. But invading Poland is much, with 40 million people, is rather difficult, as of course we see currently, and therefore they were smart enough not to try it. And you got the phenomenon, actually interesting phenomenon, that Gomulka in Poland in '56 actually told Khrushchev to fuck off. If you want to invade, come on then. Otherwise you fuck off. So.
Matthew, can you wind up soon?
Yeah. Okay. So what the point being is that this actually, it's a system of bureaucratic control which exists, and the stifling of the workers' movement, which exists across the whole world, as Tina says, in terms of making the whole notion of socialism unattractive and covering the banner in shit, and secondly, in terms of actual practical, bureaucratic control through the CP. And sitting in Glasgow, I would tell you the fact that this city is covered in flat sites and closed works is entirely actually due to the agency of the CP. Without CP, it wouldn't have been possible for Thatcher to do it. So in those terms, a fundamentally contradictory, deeply unstable, and deeply counter-revolutionary force, but one that rested on the, ironically, and say this contradiction on the revolution of 1917, and we can see the result of the fact when it cashed in its chips in 91, 92, and said, well, we'll go to capitalism. Exactly the result after in the last 30 years. But I'm presuming we'll have a decent debate on that. Thank you. Comments.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Interesting point that this is not just an abstract discussion we're having, but we do live in the shadow of the Soviet Union and all sorts of aspects. Keynesianism after the Second World War, hugely important to hold off the red thread, etc. And many lefties, want to revive that period, but we have to understand that it actually was very much tied up to the existence of the Soviet Union as a danger. So, Keynesianism perhaps was of that particular past. Our last speaker from the platform is Kevin Bean. Who's right then? State capitalist or deformed worker state? Kevin.
Well, you're perhaps going to be disappointed, Tina, that I'm going to come in as a judge. First of all, I must be the only person who hasn't studied under Hillel Ticktin, but I have read a lot of his work, and I've heard him speak, and indeed have been in a number of seminars and sessions. And I would say that Hillel, in the way that the comrades have described, his own experience in the Soviet Union really does inform his work. And in particular, he does, or certainly in the sessions that I've been in with him, he does relate the nature of economic life in the Soviet Union in the way that Ian did at the beginning, particularly on the nature of consumer products. He has a whole series of stories of the nature of consumer products in the Soviet Union, but perhaps Ian also shares that experience. I think one of the ways to approach this, and particularly in terms of the contemporary issue of the debate on the nature of the Soviet Union, is to think in terms of the politics of transition. And I think the comrades all agreed that the Soviet Union isn't just a sort of historical phenomenon. You know, all of us, wherever we were operating politically, which country and indeed in which time, would often have the retort about getting back to Russia, and arguments that what we wanted was a Soviet system, you know, still come up. I mean, it's interesting that in a couple of the recent wage disputes that some left trade union leaders who were identified with taking a pro-Russian position are also sort of identified, you know, with Stalinism, and there might be elements of their politics that reflect that. So it is actually, I think, an urgent question, not just as a debating point about the nature of the law of value, commodity production, and so on, but because it, in some ways, sort of throws up some of the problems of the politics of transition. I think that everybody here agrees that the exact form that the Soviet Union took, however we characterize it, was a product of the failure of the world revolutions. So whatever it represents, it does not represent any type of ideal form. And that's, I think, quite important to say, because, of course, there will be some comrades of a more Stalinist nature, and I don't mean that as a sort of swear word, who would have accepted the Soviet Union as an ideal form of socialist state, and would, for example, talk about the nature of the proletarian dictatorship and the nature of economic planning. And indeed, I suppose maybe up to about 25 years or so ago, would have probably adopted a position of seeing the Soviet Union as historically progressive in some form, and would have taken, I suppose, the sort of classic Trotskyist position, which I think still survives on the left, and I think in particular does have an impact on our understandings of China, which I will try and touch on. And that's in particular that the nationalized property form and the planning form did represent historical gains. And so, for example, the need to defend those property forms. And so in some aspects of world politics, there would have been some comrades who, while not regarding the Soviet Union or similar states as ideals, would say that they embodied that type of historical progress. And for the generation of Trotskyists, I mean, Trotsky himself and his other comrades, you can see just on a very human level that not wishing to abandon that, their own personal involvement would have been very difficult. And I'm not actually accusing them of that, but what I am, I suppose, arguing is that the Soviet Union did represent the dead end, and to try to see any progressive features in it at all, even in terms of the property form and maybe its historical role, I think are misleading, and indeed in some ways are actually quite dangerous. So that, for example, even in terms of great power politics, you might hear comrades say, well, of course, if the Soviet Union had been in existence in the 2000s, there wouldn't have been Afghan invasion and Iraq and so on and so forth. So just in terms of a sort of balance of power, or likewise that and again, there's a certain element of truth in some of these things, that the presence of an alternative social and economic system to the east in Europe meant that the capitalist powers had to make concessions to the working class. So on that sort of level, it's often sort of seen as a positive driver. But I think for the reasons that I think all of the comrades in various ways have expressed, it is essentially a dead end. And it's a dead end because of the nature of the containment of the revolution, the type of society that Russia was, and indeed the concessions that then had to be made. I was thinking of how we might perhaps sort of explain this in terms of the psychology or the politics of the Bolsheviks. And I came across a quote from Engels in The Peasant War in Germany, who talks about the problem of an advanced leader, an advanced party taking power, in a sense, prematurely or under very difficult circumstances. And he describes there, and you can sort of see this, I suppose, in the sense of some of these movements, that they're then forced to make a whole series of concessions to capitalism or to the dominant order, and then in a sense find themselves pursuing policies and pursuing lines simply to maintain the position of the state, and that then the economic dynamics and the economic forces within that society force them into that particular road. And he refers to Thomas Müntzer in that position, but he also suggests that the Hussite rebellion as well, the sort of communist elements in the Hussite rebellion in the 15th century would have faced or did face a similar sort of dilemma. Now, those are historical analogies, but what I think we have to think about is that the failure of the revolution and indeed the sort of political dead end that this represents then creates the sort of problems that Matthew has outlined, those political problems. So it ceases to be a sort of theoretical discussion and then becomes embodied in a state form. The other reason why I think we need to try to come to some understanding of it is, of course, the question of China and what that now constitutes. If we try to explain China through the form of, say, a deformed worker state, sorry, a degenerated worker state, then we have to arrive not only to look at the nature of the property form, but also to think of the political implications of that. It's very clear, I think, that China does represent the similar sort of morbid symptom as the Soviet Union, except I think it has a different form, and it's because of the ability of China, I think, to develop its economy, particularly the capitalist elements, that I think we are moving in China towards a capitalist restoration, or rather that the capitalist elements in that economy have successfully absorbed the Communist Party, and so we have a form in which many of the elements that were present in the Soviet Union, but in a much bigger economy, in a much more dynamic economy, and indeed I would suggest one that is being brought into the world market by the United States. That gives it, I think, a different form, a different sort of dynamism. Also, I think that economy is now starting to take on proto-imperialist forms, the export of capital being, I think, one feature of that. So if we're trying to consider the relationship of Stalinism to China, I think that it has some of the characteristics, but it has it in a very different economy, and above all, in a very different world economy. China has since the early 2000s has been part of the world economy, and it will then, I think, take a different trajectory. One last point I would also make in terms of the nature of Stalinism that comes on from Matthew's point, and I think I think all three of us all four of us would probably accept it, is the sort of political form that Stalinism has taken. And this is that in the Soviet Union, it was embodied in a state form, it was embodied in an economic form, and that gave it a certain power and prestige. The phrase actually existing socialism, or socialism with Chinese characteristics, gave it a force which allowed it, for example, to become a political form in other societies. So reformism, counter-revolutionary politics, which would have taken the form of revisionism in the socialist movement before 1914, is given an added fillip in the form of Stalinism. And I think that the existence of Stalinism as a type of ideological form, for example, the type of dictatorship, the opposition to workers' democracy, is in some senses its sort of most poisonous legacy. And I would perhaps be controversial and say that form of Stalinism doesn't only influence the explicitly Stalinist parties and groupings, but actually has influenced many people who would consider themselves Trotskyists, that the form of lack of internal democracy and discussion in the labor movement, the definitions of the dictatorship of the proletariat, and above all, I think a misunderstanding of the nature of the process of transition, have had a very deep, political impact on our movement. So if we're talking about the legacy of Stalinism, we're not just talking about the character of the Soviet Union and, a discussion on its formation. We're also looking at its political influence as a model, and that model, and indeed some of the characteristics of that model, particularly as they're interpreted and passed on, I think have become not just wrong, but actually positively counter-revolutionary and quite poisonous, and that the influence of that sort of model does extend far and wide. So the arguments about totalitarianism and the internal regime, I think, are just as important as the characterization. But it clearly, for me, doesn't represent a permanent form. It's a morbid, morbid symptoms, and particularly the morbid symptom that arises because of the nature of capitalist crisis, which at least from the end of the 19th century has posed the question of the working class taking power, but the failure of the working class to take power, and the failure of the working class to develop a political program, a political leadership to do that. So for me, the debate, I think, has to begin there, not to see the Soviet Union as either some sort of model, to see it as an aberration, but to see it as a product of particular circumstances, but then to think about its legacy. And that legacy, I think, is more than just debates about the law of value, as important as they are. There's a political practice which arises from life in the Soviet Union and has then become perhaps more generalized, even by comrades who would be politically opposed to Stalinism. But the influence of that ideology is, I think, positively counter-revolutionary, and it's one that needs to be combated.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I think there was 4 very interesting introductions. I mean, they all come from different backgrounds, the comrades, but I think there's a lot of analysis in common. It wasn't, socialism for sure, the Soviet Union, but there's different interpretations or definitions, perhaps not that far from each other, perhaps. Comrades, if you have a question or want to make a contribution, please click raise hand. And also if you have a particular question to anybody and specifically, please say so. And comrades, panelists, if you want to come in at any stage, please raise hand as well and I can bring you in. Paul Flewers was the first one to raise his hand.
There might be some problems here. My computer's clamming up. Yeah, I was very influenced by Hillel Ticktin as well. In fact, the political group I was associated with at the time was about the only one who actually adopted his analysis. But where I think Hillel kind of stopped, I think it's necessary to go further, because when you look at critique, it barely ever mentioned China. And Hillel's always put forward the idea that Stalinism was this dead end, that it had nothing positive, it had nothing going for it whatsoever. It was, the whole experience was negative. Well, I actually see it somewhat differently, because I look at what China has become. Now, who would have thought 40 years ago that China would be the second biggest economy in the world, a capitalist economy as well? Very few of us would have thought that. So something has happened with Stalinism that, yes, the Soviet Union has become this hulk called Russia today, but China has become this incredibly successful capitalist power. So I've been thinking about it, and what I've come to conclude is that Stalinism was an historical accident. It came out of a workers' revolution that was isolated back from country, as we know. But what it enabled it to do with the 5-year plans was to initiate a program of primitive accumulation. In other words, the basis of an industrial society. And those people in the 1930s who said, look, this is what they're doing in the Soviet Union is what we ought to do in the West. That sort of classic Stalinist fellow traveller type. It was absurd because we'd done it in the West, or rather the bourgeoisie had done it in the West. And so what you had effectively was a country, a big backward country with a leadership which was willing to suppress the law of value, willing to brush aside or crush underfoot any forms of opposition, was able to wrench that country through a period of primitive accumulation and very crudely, very inhumanely, very wastefully form the basis of a modern society. Now, that couldn't be done, as people recognized at the time in the 1930s, it's all in my book, that what you had, this one, what you had was this elite society, which nonetheless could modernize this huge place called Soviet Union, or later on in China. It doesn't work in small countries, as we saw with sort of sad cases such as Albania and Cambodia and so forth. It needs a certain critical mass, but nonetheless, that could happen. However, this crude modernization could only work so far, and it has to revert to capitalism at some point. They have to introduce the market. And I think what happened in the Soviet Union, they just left it too late. And in China, no doubt watching what was happening north of the border, they actually managed this transition incredibly successfully. And so if we see the Soviet socioeconomic formation as this way of carrying out a process of primitive accumulation outside of market relations through the suppression of market relations on a temporary basis, and to go through this process of primitive accumulation in a way that could not have been done under a market system. It just would not have been profitable. It wouldn't have been, no one would have done it under capitalism. Then I think with Hillel's analysis of the Soviet Union, looking at it in that broader view, and taking in the tendencies in modern societies towards state intervention, I think we can actually understand what Stalinism actually was. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Paul. Comrades, if you have a question or want to raise a comment, please click raise hand, or alternatively, I can also read out a short contribution in short question in the Q&A. Anne, please.
Okay. Thank you, comrades, for your contributions. I found it interesting. So my points are in relation to the early 1920s, and actually to mention a book, not my own book, it's yet to be written, but a book. Anyway, I don't know whether you can see it there. A book that's recently been brought out by Barbara Allen, a Russian historian, on the workers' opposition in the Russian Communist Party. Now, I know that, like, the question of the workers' opposition and the debate around there has been discussed many occasions, and usually it's been dismissed on the basis of leftism on the part of Tlaplikov and Kollontai. But what's actually interesting about this book is that she's translated an enormous amount of material. And what it does is it gives you quite a profound understanding of the difficulties that they were facing at the present time. So basically, the need to introduce the new economic policy to deal with the problems with the peasantry, but the impact that this was having on the on society, including the women, in working class women in Russian society and Soviet society who were losing their jobs, but also on the morale of party members. And what's important about it is the fact that all of the oppositions were basically complaining about the lack of democracy. So here you have a situation under Lenin where there's been a clamping down on democracy because it's necessary, in his view, to ensure stability because of the crisis at that time. So, like, I'm not trying to say that Stalin, was the new Lenin or anything like that. All I'm just trying to say is that you can kind of go, oh yeah, Stalin did this in 1928 and he suppressed democracy and it was a counter-revolution, which I absolutely agree. But you can't look at the period before it as something that was stable. Yes, there were amazing strides forward being made, particularly, I would say, in 1918, 1919. And, during the period of war communism, there were interesting national institutions being set up, like the health service, abortion, free abortion on demand, the education service, all of the things that then later Stalin used in order to facilitate his own 5-year plan. So when people say, look at what, look what Russia did, look at how Stalin had a fantastic health service, they've lost all of this, blah, 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 blah. I agree, but I don't believe that this was Stalin's initiative. I believe that what he did was instrumentalize weaponized forms that had developed at an earlier period. And that includes women in the Soviet Union as well, who were put forward as the heroines of Stalin. I just wanted to take issue with Ian's point about workers in the Soviet Union and the alcoholism. And I know that that's a point been made by Tickton, and I very much agree with it in terms of men, but it wasn't the situation for women. Women had a double burden of the work and home, but many did see, as far as I know, but even in the later part, they saw the workplace as somewhere positive because they had facilities there in the workplace that were supportive. There was childcare facilities, which again had been begun in the early 20s and carried on. But that their experience was different. And actually the tensions between men and women in the Soviet Union would be quite an interesting study, because I think it would tell you a lot about society. So when I'm talking about the woman question, I'm not like doing it to say, oh, we have forgotten about women. I'm saying this was 50% of society, and then a hugely important part of society when it came to ensuring the stability of the Soviet bureaucracy, because of the role they played in it. Finally, and I know I've been going on for too long, I think my biggest difference with Hillel Ticktin is his underestimation of the importance of ideology and particularly democracy. Hillel thinks that the collapse of the Soviet Union could only be good, that people now, you know, didn't have that obstacle anymore. But actually, of course, as we can see, its existence and the fact that it subverted Marxism and socialism and made them kind of equivalents of bureaucracy and despotism has meant a great, has brought great harm for our movement. So I think that, yeah, anyway, I'll stop there, Tina. Sorry, I have a lot to say, but it's been a very interesting set of presentations, so it's thought-provoking. Okay, that's me finished.
We've got quite a lot of comrades now with their hand up, so could I urge comrades to please be succinct? And Matthew had his hand up. You wanted to comment?
Very, very briefly, I think some interesting points been raised in terms of what Anne was saying, and the interesting thing was, well, in Poland, actually, in the early 90s, essentially, the interesting thing really about was the women had a much longer life expectancy. If you looked at it, you know, because of smoking and the diet, etc., etc. By the time you got 70, there were no men left at all. Women just lived a lot longer. You know, so in those terms, it had an interesting effect. I think in terms of what Paul was saying, in terms of China, I think we should have a separate session actually, because the position in China in the last 30 years is completely different. And you know, it's some kind of a hybrid system, but you need a whole session to debate what it is and how it functions, and the important role it plays in capitalism on a world scale now. You know, I think the other thing in terms of the whole business in terms of technical stuff and the nature of the society, of course, is that the interesting thing about what happened in East and Central Europe, of course, is that many of the countries, of course, are at a much higher technological level than Russia. I mean, you know, say Czechoslovakia, East Germany, you know, Poland, all basically had a much higher level of engineering expertise and practice and so on than Russia. And actually, you know, had a higher standard of living as well. You know, particularly obviously East Germany. And actually, what happened with the new once the system was instituted, of course, is it actually, because it insisted on autarky, and because it insisted on the primary link being to the USSR and not in between each other, of course, it actually started to generate the functioning, even on the basic level, of the economies themselves. Thanks.
Thank you, Corey. Ian, briefly, if you could. You're muted, hold on.
Just briefly to respond to Anne's absolutely correct points. Yes, it was mostly men drinking themselves to death, and the massive raise in reduction in life expectancy was predominantly among men. As I say, accidents, violence, and poisoning, it didn't apply quite so much to women. The other point, again correct, is one of the great gains, one could argue, of the October Revolution was that the overwhelming majority of women were part of the workforce, rather than being separated off into domestic labour. But of course they did domestic labour as well, as women as women used to say in Russia. Yes, International Women's Day, one day for the women and 364 for the men. And but the interesting thing about it was, of course, is the actual pay differentials between men and women was even greater in the Soviet Union than it was in the West. So, you know, at the moment in the West, in Britain, for example, women earn about 20% less than men. In the Soviet Union, it was considerably less. I mean, predominantly female. Even medicine, for example, was very badly paid and predominantly female.
Thank you, Ian. Tony, please.
Yeah, thanks. Just a few random thoughts to add to this. Firstly, I think we all agree that the Soviet Union arose as a result of the defeat of the revolution, and that Stalinism itself was counter-revolutionary. However, the position of state capitalism, I believe, was a completely bankrupt theory. The Soviet Union did not have a free market in any real sense. And part of the problem with state capitalism, of course, is when the Soviet Union did turn into a series of capitalist states, state capitalism had no explanation for what followed. And so it had no explanatory powers whatsoever. But I do think that the Soviet Union, for all its faults, and despite the counter-revolutionary Stalinist leadership, was progressive in having a nationalized social base. And I think that was very clear during the war against Nazi Germany, which in many ways was its defining characteristic and which reinvigorated it. I mean, you saw that Stalin wanted and had an alliance with Hitler up to 1941, and Stalin believed in it. He supplied Hitler's armies, and he thought he could almost join the anti-Comintern Pact, but he was, of course, severely disappointed by that. And it was despite the leadership of Stalin and the bureaucracy that the Soviet Union triumphed. And we should not forget, for example, that up to 1.5 million Jews escaped into the Soviet Union. They were literally pulled into safety by the retreating Soviet army. And it had a very different political outlook in terms of fighting the fascists once it got off the ground. And that, I said, that was the defining moment, and it allowed then Stalin to take under his wing the East European states. My own belief is one of the main reasons for the collapse of the Soviet Union was its inability to actually police the states in Eastern Europe, which were always hybrid mixtures from the start, which were, if you like, the bastions of different national revolutions. And in the end, it all came unstuck. But of course, what these theories don't take on board is China. In my view, China is a capitalist country. I don't think there's any doubt about it, but it's a very different form. It's a state-directed form of capitalism where political power still rests in the hands of the Communist Party. And I think it's that more than anything else which the United States fears, because it has been able to overcome some of the contradictions of capitalism in terms of boom and bust. I also think the problem with state capitalism is it doesn't take account of different forms of anti-imperialist revolutions. For instance, Cuba, which has been subject to an embargo for over 50 years. I don't believe that Cuba is a capitalist country. I do believe it's progressive, and clearly it's withstood the embargo and the hostility of the United States over that period. It of course has many faults, but Cuba and indeed much of Eastern Europe had certain widespread social provisions, medical, childcare, and so on, which you wouldn't get in a normal capitalist society. I remember teaching groups of East German students after East Germany became unified with West Germany, and they all went on about how the things like abortion, for example, childcare provision and other social provision had now been eliminated in essence from the unified Germany as a result. So they were extremely dissatisfied, and we're still today. I mean, the Communist Party, or now it's Die Linke, has a base in East Germany which it doesn't have in West Germany. So I think we need an analysis which takes into account the pluses as well as the minuses. I also think the old distinction between Trotskyism and Stalinism has probably disappeared. I think there are new political formations, and what were the Stalinists around the Communist Party of Britain, for example, are relatively progressive in terms of the labour movement. And again, I also don't think that people have mentioned the complete degeneration of so much of the Trotskyist movement, which has gone into the arms of imperialism, not only the Alliance for Workers' Liberty, but as Dave Hill will testify, the anti-capitalist resistance, which I call the anti-communist resistance, the USSR, which, you know, I mean, is a cheerleader for war in Ukraine. I mean, it's backing NATO's proxy war, and its leader, Gilbert Achcar, supported the bombing of Libya, for example. And it's not only just the ACR. I mean, there are other Trotskyist groups as well, which I think are living in another world, to be quite honest. So I think we do have to understand the degeneration of a whole section of the Marxist left. But I say, I mean, state capitalism explained absolutely nothing, not least the popular revolution in places like Cuba, but also Nicaragua, Venezuela, and so on. I mean, we don't have all the answers through the traditional Trotskyist analysis.
Thank you, Tony. Paul Smith, I think you want to speak, but your camera doesn't work or something. So do you want to just be heard? Paul, you can talk now if you want. Paul? Nope. Okay. I'll bring in Bill then, please. Bill Templer.
Yeah.
Hi.
Can you see my, can you hear me? Yeah, I
hand.
agree with the notion that you have to look away from the Soviet Union. And I've been long connected with Bulgaria as an academic, and Bulgaria was far more successful in agriculture, in health, preventive medicine, in education in very interesting ways, and much more. So that one point that I'd make here, and that several speakers have made, replying to Ian, who I think has a very, if Ian had studied in Bulgaria, he might have a very different presentation today, that you have to look at also the GDR. There's a new Forschungsstelle DDR that has opened up in Germany that has published extraordinary new study on healthcare and preventive medicine in the GDR and what they tried to build up. And I think those things have to be looked at. That is to say, what was accomplished despite the Cold War, despite the CIA, you know, and everything that was being done to destroy socialism in Eastern Europe. And I speak as a Chicagoan who grew up in the Cold War and remember that very well. Both in East Germany and Bulgaria today, eastern parts of Germany, there's a great deal of nostalgia, you know, a nostalgia for what was achieved under socialism. And you need an ethnography of people's lives, including also autoethnography, which is going on in post-socialist studies of different kinds, which most speakers didn't mention, of real existing socialism and what people remember. Of course, people remember in distorted ways at times, but I am surrounded by people who think their lives were 100% better 40 years ago than they are today in Bulgaria. Another complex you're not addressing at all, though Ian mentioned it in 4 words, is council communism. And I am astounded why council communism is not being looked at very seriously today by people who are critical, not just of Stalin, but also, as council communism was, and as Pankhurst was, of Lenin, not just Stalin, and of Trotsky, such as Otto Rühle, Pannekoek, Paul Matic, who came from Germany to the States, Pempert, the Hollander Gorter, in some ways Rosa Luxemburg, and others who were involved in the Council Republic in 1919 in Munich. Why are we not looking at council communism? And
Comrade, we actually had a session on the communists a few weeks ago, so we did.
So I missed that. Yeah, I'm sorry, but I mean that is a very different approach that I think should be looked at more. And a number of the works in that are in German and never translated, are in Dutch and never translated, and that is a problem because of the very low level of.
I think your internet is now breaking up. Comrades, I think you've used up your time now as well.
Thanks. I just wanted to make those points. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, Steve Freeman, please.
Okay, thank you, comrades. Because I'll mute myself. Here we go. Yeah, I'm basically going to line up with John Holliday. And I think I'd like to go back before the Soviet Union, because I don't think you need to have a special theory to be invented to explain the Soviet Union. If you understand the development of capitalism that Marx and Engels analysed in the 19th century, they explained how capital would accumulate into larger and larger units. They would accumulate into bigger monopolies and trusts and corporations. So if you read Engels' Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, in that book he says that the transformation of capital either into joint stock companies or trusts or into state ownership, he says, does not do away with the capitalist nature of the productive forces. And he goes on to say that the modern state, no matter which form, is essentially a capitalist machine, the state of the capitalists, the ideal personification of total national capital. Here's the idea that capital will accumulate into national capital. The more it proceeds, he says, to take over the productive forces, the more does it actually become the national capitalist. The more citizens does it exploit. The workers remain wage workers, proletarians. So Engels is talking about this in the 1880s. And I think what happens in the Soviet Union is a manifestation of the process of capital accumulation. So I think that you get many forms of capital, as John said earlier on: state monopoly capitalism, multinational capitalism, and so on and so forth. And that's the dynamic development of capitalism. And on the political side, I want to say this point, that the fundamental idea of Marxism is the state is an instrument of a ruling class. And we have people here saying, oh, it's not really a ruling class, it's just a ruling elite. It's a ruling group, it's a ruling everything except a class. But if you're going to say you can have a state and it doesn't imply a ruling class, then you're breaking with a fundamental idea of Marxism, that class equals state and state equals a ruling class. Now, you might have argued Russia was a working class was in charge, but I don't think anybody's really argued that here. So I would say the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union is a transitional society. It's been in transition from 1970 to 1992. And as John said, in 1917, the vast majority were peasant farmers. Wage laborers were a minority. But the revolution, industrialization in the 1920s and 30s made wage labor the predominant form of exploitation that took place. Of course, there were prisoners, as John said, slaves in prisons. So we have ourselves a transitional society in transition from a peasant economy to a wage labor economy. And so Tony says state capitalists aren't predicting what Russia would do. Yes, we are predicting that it's in transition to capitalism and it's going to end up as capitalism. And guess what? What's anybody saying it is today? Yes, it's capitalist today, run by oligarchs. I'll make just one final point, Tina. I know they've got to be. The Russian Revolution was a democratic revolution. It created the world's most democratic state, but it never abolished capitalism. It never abolished wage labor because it couldn't do so in one country. War communism was an attempt to suppress wage labor and prices and all the rest of it, and it was an economic disaster. So in 1921, when the working class in Russia started going on strike and protesting against war communism, there were strikes in Petrograd, Kronstadt, etc. You cannot abolish class, you cannot abolish capital by passing a law or rule. So Lenin understood that. Of course, he went for the new economic policy, which then helped to revive the economy. I will finish at that point.
Thank you.
Just say this: the USSR never abolished wage labor, it never abolished money, and it never abolished the exploitation either at any point. And if anybody thinks it did so, tell us when it happened then, because you won't be able to.
Thank you, Steve. Gary, please.
Thanks, and thanks to the four presenters. They're very learned, scholarly presentations that I found very informative. A bit daunting, actually, to speak on this subject because everybody knows so much about it. But I kind of want to come to it from a very simple perspective. And I guess, in a sense, a sort of straightforward activist perspective. I mean, for me, it's sort of, I mean, a few weeks ago in these sessions, we were talking about how capitalism is defined by the mode of the means of production being owned by the bourgeoisie. And in the 1917 revolution, the working class did actually seize that private property. Not all of it in one go, but in a process, they did seize that private property. And they fought the Civil War to retain that to retain the means of production. And what Ian was saying also about how there were no commodities in the Soviet Union, that money wasn't real money in the Soviet Union, and workers, work was mandatory rather than being the nominal choice that people pretend it is under capitalism. None of that suggests to me that the Soviet Union was anything like capitalism, anything like state capitalism. It just doesn't make sense to me. And the fact that the revolution did seize the means of production, private property as at the scale of the means of production, ceased to exist in the Soviet Union, and there was no bourgeoisie in the Soviet Union, right? I mean, there was not a class that owned the means of production. This is hugely significant, and I think that was an achievement. That was an achievement that millions of people died for. Let's remember. And the trouble with saying that the Soviet Union was a dead end, I mean, it's very easy to say now because we know that it died, right? But revolutionaries right up through to the Second World War, for instance, didn't think that it was a dead end. They thought it was worth fighting for. They fought for political revolution in the Soviet Union. Obviously, they failed, but that was a real challenge. And the trouble with saying it's a dead end and that there was no achievement, that there was nothing gained from the revolution, effectively, is that every time we are in a revolutionary situation, we won't know whether the world revolution is going to follow our local initiatives. So what are we meant to do? Do we wait until we're absolutely certain that there's going to be a world revolution and that capitalism globally is going to be defeated? Or do we do what the Bolsheviks did in 1917? I don't think we're in that different a position, right? So it almost leads to a new form of stagism, right? If you say that the Soviet Union was a dead end, a lost cause, completely negative, something that was going nowhere, right? Then you actually say, well, we don't want to create one of those again. Least of all, do we want to die for it? So let's not have a revolution until we're absolutely certain that it's a world revolution. And I think that means let's not have a revolution, basically. So I mean, from my simple perspective, that's how I respond to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Gary. Brian, please.
The same way Marx had to explain why capitalism was a crisis-ridden mode of production, and therefore historically illegitimate in the long run, we have to explain why the Soviet Union was a crisis-ridden, distinct mode of production. And in the chat, I explained how Marx guides us to defining a mode of production. To really understand what happened in the Soviet Union, you really have to understand capitalism. We all talk about the profit motive, yet few people understand what the profit motive really is. Look, when the capitalists seek to improve their rate of profit or their share of profits, they raise the productivity of their labor, of their workers. Implicit in that is they reduce the labor time expended by their workers. Implicit in that, they reduce their share of the labor time of society. How then can they make extra profits? The answer is through unequal exchange. Because the capitalist not only exploits his own workers or her own workers, but the workers of less productive competitors, okay? So that overcomes the contradiction in raising the productivity of labor and the economizing on labor time. This couldn't happen in the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, the labor of the individual became part of the labor of society immediately. Therefore, when enterprises reduced their labor time and their labor force, they reduced their share of the labor time of society. And because that society was based on margins, they couldn't deliver what the margin required. So what did they do? Instead of innovating, they duplicated. they produced 2 plants, 3 plants with the same labor content in order to increase their share of the labor time of society, which meant that this economy couldn't be a dynamic economy because it had no way of overcoming the contradiction between raising the productivity of labor and reducing their share of the labor time of society. Now, this is the breakthrough I made years ago in this, and Hillel Tickton was aware of that in discussion. He wanted me to write an article for the journal, but it's all on my website. It explains why the Soviet Union could not be a viable mode of production because it had no mechanism whatsoever to exploit workers efficiently. A communist society doesn't have margins. It doesn't have the emphasis on margins because there isn't unpaid labor. A communist society, in fact, is very, very simple. Its motive is purely the reduction in prices, the economy of labor time, and everybody in society benefits from falling prices. You don't have classes, you don't have a caste or anything like that, but that was impossible in the Soviet Union. So if we are going to be able to convince workers why the Soviet Union failed and why a communist society therefore need not fail, we really have to understand what the hell was happening in the Soviet Union.
Thank you, Brian. Last person to speak from the floor is Dave Hill, and then we're going to ask the panelists to come back and sum up.
Yeah, okay, thanks, comrades. Well, this has all been very negative, hasn't it? All been very negative, except for Bill Templer, Tony Greenstein, Ian Spencer, and Brian Greene. The only people, I think, to mention anything positive from the experience of the Soviet Union and the East European communist states and Cuba and Bolivia and Venezuela. Just as, by the way, I'm hugely critical of Stalinism. This is not a eulogy for Stalinism or for the Soviet Union. But what are we as Marxists about? We're about improving. One of the things we're about is about improving the material conditions of people's existence. And as I put in the chat, as somebody mentioned, I think Brian Greene mentioned, he added a year to what I normally give in my lectures, but he said quite rightly that life expectancy plummeted by 10 years with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Bill Templer, and I'm so sorry that we couldn't have heard more from Bill, lives in Bulgaria, and he talks in his conversations with me and in his theoretical work, he talks about the nostalgia. And one of the other comrades mentioned about the Donbass, about the Russian population in the Donbass, look forward to the good old times. And I think it was Brian Greene said that apart from 2 countries, all the other Eastern European states, in all of those states, a majority of the population say life was better under communism. Now, of course, it wasn't for those who got banged up in concentration camps or gulags. Of course, it wasn't. But as Marxists, to return, it's the material conditions of people's existence that is important to us. And we look at Venezuela, we look at the misiones, the health and the education misiones. We look at Cuba, we look at Bolivia. We look at positives that come as well as the negatives. We look at the positives that have come from those semi-socialist, call it, this is what tonight's debate is about. Cuba, China, USSR, are they capitalist, socialist or what? They're attempts at, in various times in their history, attempts at developing socialism and leading to communism. And I'll end up by mentioning China. I happen to work at the University of Wuhan in China. And yes, I did come back from China in November 2019, the very month it broke out. It wasn't me what brought it back, honest. And every university there, yeah, they have to study Xi Jinping thought. They have to study Marxism. Yeah. What they have done is bring out 900 million people out of poverty. we're looking at the positive. What I'm doing here is saying we need to look at the positives as well as having a critical appreciation of the negatives and the bureaucracy and the authoritarianism. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got one more, I think. Barry. Oh no, he's gone again. I think Barry Biddulph is trying to come in, but I think he's got issues with his internet. He's gone now again. If he comes back later, I might be able to bring him back in. Thank you, Dave. Okay, let's move to the main panelists and have a round of summing up, suggest in the order that you first spoke. So Ian, please.
Try to be as quick as I can. Some of you already know that my journey to breaking with Stalinism was through studying the Council of Communists. I'd read Pannekow before I read Trotsky. I'm critical of, and I think I've come to terms, as it were, with the Council of Communists as well, in the sense that they failed. But notwithstanding that, I think there is remains a grain of something that's worthwhile, and that is to be critical of the authoritarian tendencies among some people. I mean, when I was going through my Council Communist phase, one of the things we would say, well, Trotskyism is just Stalinism's loyal opposition. Really just a reference to the tendency to be authoritarian, and looking at some of the Trotskyist parties, the Workers' Revolutionary Party. Give us a break, will you? You know, if you look at the way they conducted themselves, it was more Stalinist than the Stalinists. And I joined the YCL when I was 13, and it was quite affable, really, compared to a lot of the Trotskyist groups. Anyway, that's not the point. When we're talking about the Soviet Union as it isn't a mode of production, therefore it has no mature point. It's not as if it could evolve, as it were, into socialism. It's like saying, you know, it just couldn't be. I mean, Trotsky was quite clear that it would either revert to capitalism or there would have to be another revolution. And I think that's true. It requires another revolution. The world is rotten ripe for communist revolution, in the sense that all the conditions are there for the possibility of communism. The problem is we can't get there because the class can't come into being, not least of which because of the whole sorry, miserable legacy of Stalinism. And of course, imperialism. Let's not forget that as well. In the Soviet Union today, yes, it's moving to capitalism, but in a bizarre, grotesque, distorted form. I mean, Putin's an ex-KGB man, as you know, and what we see is Putin reclaiming bits of Soviet nostalgia. Stalinism is nationalism. How else do you make sense of the idea of socialism in one country? So you ended up with a Soviet nationalism. Some of you might have noticed on the pictures of my PowerPoint the striking similarity between Soviet posters and Nazi Germany posters. That similarity is real. You look at Soviet art of the 1930s, it's like fascist art. And the Soviet art of the early revolutionary period in the 1920s was fantastic. And then as soon as as Stalin takes power, it becomes more and more fascistic in terms of its artistic expression. It's not about it being negative. You know, there are the gains of the revolution are there and were tangible. But let's remember that nationalisation is not the common ownership of the means of production. Yes, free healthcare is absolutely central to any demand we would make. But the National Health Service, like the Soviet Health Service, I was a patient in a Russian hospital for a week. I bloody nearly starved to death. The treatment was awful. It was a dreadful. I mean, the Soviet medicine was as defective as a Soviet car. Finally, I'll just leave you with this thought. Yes, things were better in the GDR. Yes, things were better in Hungary. But there was a reason for that, wasn't there? In Hungary in 1956, the Soviet Union knew it had to make concessions. And life got better for all normal Hungarians under those concessions. And the same goes for the GDR. And there were other satellite states that had better conditions as well. But let's not forget, you know, the CZ motorbike was rubbish. The Trabant was rubbish. And there were these common features of Stalinism incapable of producing anything worth having. Defective use values, not commodities, defective use values. It had no future. but we have a future.
Excellent. Thank you, Ian. John, please.
Yeah, thanks. I'm a bit confused about the debate, really. It is as though, it's what I said from the very beginning, it's as though people don't, acknowledge that we now have an international world capitalist system all over the world. People live in, largely similar conditions, in that the vast majority are dependent on wage labor in order to live. They're dependent on money. The social relations of production are very similar throughout the world. If I was an ordinary worker, I am an ordinary worker, but a member of the working class listening to the discussion tonight, what I find, unusual about it, I don't think anybody would be able to make any sense of it. There are people defending the Soviet Union, saying that China isn't capitalist, all sorts of things. When for most people, their experience certainly throughout Western Europe, United States, I would say in Russia, in China, etc., is very similar. Wage labor is generalized throughout the world. It takes place under the domination of capital. Capitalism is a world system. It strikes me that, I do go back to Marx a lot, but just the quotation from the German ideology written in the 1940s, and he's talking about communism. Communism is not a state of affairs which has to be established, an idea which reality will have to adjust itself. We call communism the real movement which abolishes the present state of things. The conditions of this movement result from premises now in existence. The mass of propertyless workers presupposes the world market through competition. The proletarian can thus exist world historically, only exist world historically, just as communism, its activity, can have only a world historical existence. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about a worldwide capitalist system. Let's not, people are talking about the achievements of the Soviet Union. For most people, if you talk to them, what they understand by socialism and communism is what happened in the Soviet Union, or what they've got in China, or what they had in Eastern Europe, and so. And people do not want that sort of society. No democracy, people constantly in a precarious situation and really grotesque symptoms. Throughout the Soviet Union, people in the gulags, people submitted to states, to slave labor, no free discussion, absolutely nothing at all. And what the result of that was the system that we've got now within Russia, gangsterism, basically, and gangsterism that can develop into a world war. And these are the conditions which common humanity, which were the worldwide working class face. So let's have a real discussion about the nature of a worldwide capitalist system, the different forms that takes in the nation states which are placed on top of that system. Let's have a discussion about how we can overcome international worldwide capitalism, and there's only one way to do that, and that's through a worldwide communist revolution. Now that sounds fairly abstract, and it has got to take different forms, but unless people begin to understand that we do have a system that dominates us all and has to be got rid of on an international basis, then we will get absolutely nowhere. That's the end of my contribution.
Thank you. I mean, that does beg the question that Gary's question early on, wasn't it? So unless we know we're going to make it, the world revolution is going to follow, that means we can't make revolution, which is the same position that the Bolsheviks were in. A very unhappy situation in that sense. Okay, Matthew, please.
If I get this to unmute. Okay. Yeah, thanks. I think it's been a very useful discussion. I think that the thing is obviously to draw a balance sheet of this, and it has to be negative, thoroughly negative. I mean, you say, okay, we'll start with in terms of the impact on Marxism itself. I mean, there's first of all the liquidation of the cadre that actually brought about the October Revolution, the most important event in human history. I mean, those comrades were overwhelmingly slaughtered by Stalinist bureaucracy. Which is is one of the most awful crimes in history. It's the damage to the fact they actually perverted Marxism itself. The Stalinists started altering bits of books in order to suit themselves. You've had different elements and so on. And it's going to take a long time to get that out of Marxism. The introduction of sociology and all this other extra crap. And the as a perversion of Marx's method, which has been a major issue. The other thing is, as a negative point, is that if we hadn't had Stalinism, we would not be in this position now. The working class has had the chance to overthrow capitalism on a number of occasions, 1945 being the prime one, in which Stalinism has restabilized capitalism quite deliberately for its own purposes. The working class was in an excellent position to actually dispose of the system in 45. If you look at the French, they were, again, de Gaulle actually fled the country due to the general strike of the working class. Who stabilized the system? Who brought him back? The CP. The CP. It's a criminal conspiracy against the interests of the working class. It can't be seen as anything else. It's why we sit here in the rotten state we are now. We have to say this is totally completely negative. Any bits and pieces we may say, about they did this and they did that. Yeah, odds and sods. Doesn't weigh against that at all. I mean, we can say. I think obviously you can see the difference. Once the bureaucracy decides it's going to go for capitalism in 1991, you can see the impact on the working class of that being the case, and the fact that obviously you have a situation in which the working class, life expectancy and so on, the fact that they're immiserated, the fact that industry is destroyed, the fact that people are forced to flee countries, large chunks of the population of Poland are forced to move to various bits of Europe in order to get a living and all this sort of stuff. And again, it's a means of control. I mean, the working class in Poland quite clearly understood they're being robbed. If you look at it, suddenly, there's suddenly an explosion of democracy. It's supposed to be a great thing. By the time you got to the second lot of elections in the early 90s, about 10% of working class areas were voting because they understood a whole lot of them were a bunch of crooks, and none of them were going to represent workers, and they weren't interested in the work. They were only interested in robbing the working class. People ain't that stupid. So the thing is, the balance sheet must be completely and thoroughly negative. And say anything else is really just misunderstands where we're at and where we've been. But we have to understand history. If we don't understand history, then we're really lost, which is what the importance of this is. Thanks.
Thank you, Matthew. Kevin, final speaker. You're muted, comrade. This is your first time on Zoom, yeah?
Yeah. Well, we actually cancelled each other out, Tina.
Oh, sorry.
That's what happened, yeah. I'd like to quote Samuel Beckett on the question of the Russian Revolution, and that is, fail better next time in terms of, gambling on the world revolution. Yes, we can't just wait for the perfect set of circumstances, and I don't think anybody in this meeting is suggesting that because of the history of the Soviet Union that we will set up so many preconditions for an ideal situation that we won't do it. And I think that what we're attempting to do is to draw up some form of a balance sheet, and I think we're also not just looking at it historically, we're looking at the impact of that debate on our movement, and I think comrades have expressed that very well. On the sort of positive nature, I actually said expressly that I had believed in the positive nature of aspects, historically progressive aspects of the Soviet Union, but I'm much less inclined to take that line now. But I am interested in the nostalgia that Bill Templer and Dave Hill and so on refer to. I actually, a few weeks ago, was in Leipzig in the former DDR for around about 10 days or so, and did talk to a few people of my own age. In other words, people who grew up in that system. And I'm quite willing to sort of accept that that there were many people who had an idea that this was a genuine attempt to build socialism. And I can quite easily see that the current state of many people's lives in the former Eastern countries, would make them want to go back or look back. But I think the fact that there were popular forces that supported this system, and indeed in other movements that were attempting to replicate it in other parts of Europe, still doesn't make it socialist, in my view, not just in terms of the nature of the economy, but the key element of workers' democracy. And again, the comrades expressed, this, I think, quite well. I don't need to go back over that. It's certainly, I think, something that was, was an essential part of Stalinism and Stalinized politics that other people picked up. And that was then modeled on some of the practices of the early 1920s. McShane referred to those, and the politics of a country under siege, a country that's facing civil war, surrounded by enemies, and indeed, faced by capitalist elements within, isn't, I think, the basis, an ideal model. It's an emergency situation, and again, it all flows from the failure of that revolution to spread. So, in a sense, the revolution in Russia is on the defensive, almost from the very first moment, almost, I'd say, from the autumn, from November 1918. We could probably date it to the failure of events in Berlin in that period. But I wanted to perhaps just point a little bit further towards the question of China, because I think it is a topic worthy of its own discussion. And I think that there are quite significant differences, both between the nature of Chinese society, Chinese economy, and above all, its relationship with the world market. And I think this is where the Communist Party leadership, particularly under Deng, and particularly looking at the example of the USSR, made, I think, quite a conscious attempt to integrate China into the world market. And the relationship of China with the world market, and particularly with American capitalism, puts it in a very different position than the USSR. So if we're seeing them as having similarities, and I think Tony's argument about state-directed capitalism and the role of the Communist Party is interesting in that regard. But I think it's China's ability to take part in the world market, to be an integral part of it. In other words, it's not like the Soviet Union. It is able to, it's able to sell goods. It actually is quite an essential part of that world market. Now, that is, I think, a new form. And one of our problems, and I mean, I confess this freely because I don't speak Chinese and I have to rely upon specialists, but I think we have to undertake really quite a serious study of the economic forms of China. And it's clearly different from Stalinism, but on the other hand, its leadership have quite clearly learned about the problems of the latter period of the Soviet Union. But if we're looking for a key difference, I think it must lie in that embrace of the world market. And above all, the role of the United States from a very early period in believing that it could, in a sense, take China under its wing. And in a way, the disaster for the Americans, I think, is quite, is quite clear there. The other, just the sort of very last point is about the sort of long shadow that the Soviet Union casts. And that, I think, is political. And it's, in one sense, for many people, in both the capitalist world and, of course, in the colonial world, it was some sort of alternative. and it always represented both a pole of attraction and also a diplomatic partner. You know, you could, as a state, attempt to play off East versus West and so on. I also think that, you know, for many people, and this is where the sort of quote positive element of it is, that the ideals that were originally, you know, it encompassed still had that ability to inspire. And I'm thinking of numerous examples over the course of my lifetime. But I think that we have to, I suppose, be really quite realistic. And that is that the kernel of that idea, which is still contained in, you know, the writings of Lenin and Trotsky and you know, the Russian Revolution, is that the kernel of that idea was destroyed under Stalinism. And above all, it represents a failed opportunity, but more than a failed opportunity, one that became positively counter-revolutionary, both in the actual sense, but also in the sense of the way that it besmirched the ideals. And it has, you know, proved to be a hindrance and a barrier to socialist revolution. The points that John makes about world revolution, about world system, I think are more and more amplified by events in China and by the nature of the Chinese economy. And that, of course, is, I think, where we should start, and of course where Stalinism and socialism in one country didn't start, or rather they started and tried to stop it. So I think the discussion has been interesting, and I certainly think that the study of China is one that we must engage in really quite seriously, and not just simply take some labels and some patterns from the Soviet Union. I think its pattern of development now is very different. Anyway, I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm sure we all become experts on China soon. We have to all read the media, because there's another war coming. That we'll get one version of what China is. So quite right. I think we have to understand it ourselves and what it means. Okay, comrades, that was a really interesting discussion. I thought some differences. I don't actually think there were huge differences. Socialism has to be international, I think, is the one of the key lessons, the key ideas. You can start in one country, you'll have to start in one country, but unless this can then act as a spark to other countries to follow suit soon, you get into problems like exactly the Soviet Union or Russia did, very much almost from the first few months, years after its revolution, turning into what perhaps could be described as the opposite of socialism. Thank you, comrades, for participating. This was now the end of our first block of sessions, where we wanted to give an overview of where we think Marxism is and has developed. In the next few sessions, then, we're looking closer into some aspects that have been touched on, like Marx and democracy will now develop over 3 sessions, looking at Marx, how he developed, and those around him, how he developed their ideas of democracy over 3 sessions. So we're starting with that next Thursday, looking at the young Marx before 1848, and then looking at the transition in the next sessions, 2 sessions after that. If anybody has ideas on developing this program further, Marx and, you know, nationalism, Marx and women, Marx and religion, so there is space, get in touch and let us know if you're interested in helping out presenting a session. Thank you very much to the speakers. Thank you very much to the audience, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye, comrades.